I'd like to preface this by saying two things. One, I have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm basically the video essay equivalent of hooking up a mushroom to an electronic synthesizer. And two, I'm going to be critiquing Riot Games, the company, with regards to some of their storytelling decisions. Because over the last few years, the company has consistently performed below the standard I set for them. Arguably a standard that they themselves helped shape. It has crystallized in my mind that Riot Games is largely incapable of delivering a quality story, especially one that I'm satisfied with. When I say that, I don't mean that everyone who works there is an incompetent storyteller. For one thing, all the writers and artists working there are industry professionals with degrees and many years of experience crafting stories. So it's not sensible to suggest that they're all charlatans who don't know what they're doing. I don't work at Riot, and as such, any speculation I present to explain their, in my opinion, consistent underperformance in the narrative department would be insincere. However, I'd argue that from an audience perspective, it doesn't matter so much why a piece of art is subpar, mainly that it is. With that in mind, in 2014, Riot Games announced that they were planning to retcon and rework much of their established lore from 2009, evolving the scope of their story far beyond the confines of a 10-person battle arena. Gone would be the titular League of Legends with its summoner mages and the Institute of War, replaced instead with what they envisioned would be a more vibrant and expansive world. In a since-deleted dev blog, Tommy Gnox describes how the pre-retcon story decisions made by the narrative teams were making writers feel limited and creatively stagnant, a state of affairs which would never really cease to be, even 10 years later. Every new champion needed a reason to join and remain in the league, and as their number grew, the net result was that over time, the world started to feel, well, small and eventually less interesting. The institutions we'd designed fostered creative stagnation, limiting the ways that champions, factions, and Runeterra itself could grow and change. Furthermore, the very idea of all-powerful summoners made champions little more than puppets manipulated by godlike powers. The background we'd created to explain in-game action was ultimately restricting the potential narrative development of the game's defining characters. Faced with these limitations, our use of narrative elements tightly bound to the original vision dwindled, because they felt fundamentally restrictive to our hopes for a more vibrant and expansive world. In response, we started to tell stories that explored the furthest limits of League's original creative framework. This new direction, heralded by the dev blog, was met with mixed reception by the fans, some of the more prophetic of which harbored strong doubts about Riot's ability to commit to a broader, more ambitious form of storytelling, as it would demand a certain degree of consistency. It's one thing to publish a whimsical periodical a la the Journal of Justice, but to create compelling stories for each champion with a start, middle, and end? It could never work. And in a sense, it didn't. But with this fresh new canvas before them and a paintbrush $1 billion long, Riot was, theoretically, free to tell whatever story they liked. Perhaps even something heavier and darker than usual. An exploration of themes more serious than their standard go-to? Unfortunately, they picked genocide. In the pre-retcon era, Demacia and Noxus fell into fairly uncomplicated Righteous Kingdom of Good and Deranged Empire of Evil tropes, respectively, without much evidence to tarnish the image of the first nor improve on the optics of the second. This changed post-retcon, with Demacia rendered less pristine, still a righteous kingdom of espoused chivalry, but with an authoritarian streak and a violent, oppressive ideology against all mages and their ilk.
Magic corrupts Demacia from within!
Demacia was now the first and only place in all of Runeterra where mages were persecuted, killed, exiled, tortured, or imprisoned because of the circumstances of their birth. Certainly a pronounced departure from your generic City of Gondor ripoff. It's the classic X-Men premise, where a supernatural ability can be code for aspects of human personality or identity that fall outside the socially accepted norm.
Have you tried not being a mutant?
Much like Dragon Age, League of Legends was boldly walking the fine line of what if oppression, but justified. And at the onset, it didn't seem like they were doing too badly. It was a grim change, sure, but hey, it was interesting. However, this particular brand of oppression story is not without its pitfalls.
Vivian, are you saying you wouldn't rather live in a land where mages aren't herded into cages like dogs?
Which land is that? The one where mages are feared and despised as tyrants?
I'm the first to admit magisters aren't perfect, but they've also done great things. They're allowed to.
Monstrous things as well. Or you wouldn't be here, would you?
Locking people into cages isn't the answer.
Naturally. First we execute those who will not submit, then we deal with the rest.
One of the fundamental issues with a mage oppression story is that once you stop to think about it, it doesn't fully add up. In his 2019 article, The Problem with Oppressed Mages, Oren Ashkenazi writes, "How do you oppress someone who can shoot fire out of their hands? Consider a mage who can control the weather. They can't summon lightning strikes or storms, but they can turn a day from rainy to sunny and back again. The ability to make it rain in dry areas or stop raining in wet areas would increase agricultural profits by an untold margin. This mage would be in huge demand from monarchs and churches in a historical setting or presidents and CEOs in a modern one." Oren posits that a group of people who can conjure food and twist the fabric of reality with a snap of their fingers would more likely be coveted than despised, since the ability to completely circumvent seasonal weather and crop rotations is more than enough to make even the staunchest bigot pause for thought. He uses Rudolph as a prime example, a magical reindeer whose irregularity is constantly mocked until it is proven useful, whereupon it is valued and praised. Differences are punished unless they are exploitable in some way, in which case they are rewarded. There are occasional exceptions, but the rule holds true in most cases. Magic, as it is portrayed in fiction, is almost always exploitable, usually on levels far beyond what any muggle could ever imagine. Mages would be loved and showered in accolades, not despised for their differences. This means that while it's technically possible for mages to be oppressed if all the world's governments were united to fight them, governments would never do that. A supernatural power simply doesn't align with the reasons anyone is actually oppressed, any more than athletes are oppressed for being really good at sports. Oren is also quick to point out that oppression flows from power, not toward it, and it is somewhat counterintuitive for a person with tangible, awesome power to be persecuted by a state or mob, since typically power is used to protect from persecution, not as a justification of it. Even disregarding the exact logistics of how anyone can persecute someone with a flamethrower up their sleeve, to possess power is to possess control and influence over others. Rich people are rarely hunted down for the crime of being born wealthy, after all. Another criticism Oren mentions is the implicit or explicit justification of mage bigotry within a mage oppression story. Magic is wild and unpredictable, you see, uncontrollable and destructive. Therefore, a living mage is a threat in and of themselves, a ticking time bomb that could go off at any minute.
You're just spouting chantry propaganda, Vivian.
My dear, what a world you must live in. Do you know how young mages are found? A little girl has a nightmare, and in her sleep, she burns her house down. A teenage boy has a fit. and lightning rips his mother to pieces. Imagine your own childhood and what would have happened if the darkest corner of your heart had a will of its own. People don't learn the fear of magic at Chantry services, my dear. They learn it from us.
It's a cute idea, but it doesn't make for a very good parallel to real-life marginalized groups. If magical babies are a serious threat to the people around them, it means muggles actually have a reason to be afraid. Even if the muggles' reaction to this danger is overly harsh, they're still acting out of self-preservation. This is almost never the case in real-life oppression. Black people are not a threat to white people. Queer people are not a threat to straight people. Immigrants and refugees, no matter their skin tone or religion, are no threat to developed countries like the United States. Ultimately, any story that tries to pose the question, what if oppression was an understandable response to an atomized threat, has, in my opinion, missed the forest for the trees. It is a waste of moral reasoning to try and approach oppression on oppression's terms, and whatever answers lie behind that question are not worth exploring. However, as I've said, these issues are more generalized to any such mage oppression story, and are perhaps overshadowed by a problem more specific to the story of Riot games. If you choose, for whatever ungodly reason, to place your roster of endearing characters within an exterminationist kingdom, how do you reconcile their active participation in genocide with their continued sympathetic characterization? Garen Crownguard is the eldest scion of the Crownguard family, a noble house tasked with protecting the regent and the royal line. They guard the crown, you see, hence they are called Crown Guard. Get it? In addition, Garen is the current leader of the Dauntless Vanguard, the most elite army in all Demacia, charged with eliminating any threat to the Demacian state, including but not limited to mages. To that end, the Dauntless Vanguard work in tandem with the Mage Seekers, a sort of secret police whose job it is to locate and contain any magic people or arcane artifacts. More on them later. What this means is that Garen and his army are, among other things, tasked with either arresting innocent mages or slaughtering them en masse. They don't run the concentration camps, but they do run the firing squad. According to his bio, Garen himself justifies these atrocities as necessary and virtuous deeds performed with the goal of protecting his country from the corruptive forces of magic. After all, his uncle was killed by a mage. Their uncle was killed in the line of duty by a mage before Garen turned 11. Garen saw the pain this brought to his family and the fear in his younger sister's eyes. He knew then for certain that magic was the first and greatest peril that Demacia faced, and he vowed never to let it within their walls, only by following their founding ideals and by displaying their unshakable pride could the kingdom be kept safe. It's a bit like saying you hate the gays because your father ran away with another man, really. This worldview is further fostered by the general anti-mage culture present in his country, and the few instances of actually evil, dangerous mages causing harm to people which he is called upon to save. This, in turn, brings him into conflict with his younger sister, Luxana Crownguard, who does not share his convictions. Lux is a mage, a fact which creates constant consternation for her family, who do their homophobic level best to keep her from getting into trouble. Because of this, she is more sympathetic to mages than her peers, and generally believes that the mage seekers do more harm than good. She is young and idealistic, and appears to have an open mind, despite also being a bit of a thought-terminating centrist. She's the sort of person who condemns all forms of violence, no matter where they come from, and can't seem to grasp that not all violence is of equal magnitude. She doesn't seem to grok that her family has maintained their position of power by directly contributing to the escalating repression of mages, and quite literally defending the status quo. She doesn't identify that her noble status has protected her from facing the same persecution as her arcane countrymen, nor does she examine or reckon with her own culpability in the matter, or that of her own family. She sort of thinks that she's just like the other mages because her family made her feel bad for being a mage, I guess. She doesn't see this as a systemic issue, largely because Riot Games is incapable of expressing it as one. By the end of the Lux comics, she is presented as this ideological alternative in the Demacian conflict, a sort of middle ground between Sylas's firebrand liberation and her uncle's unabashed campaign of death. You know, a compromise between emancipation and state-sanctioned genocide. This is not a good look for her. This is awful. Perhaps it would have been best if she'd married Jarvan after all. Speaking of which, Prince Jarvan Lightshield IV is heir apparent to the throne of Demacia. He is brash, hard-headed, self-righteous, tempestuous, and, broadly speaking, a piece of shit. Jarvan blames the mages for his father's death, since he was mysteriously killed on the day of the Mage Rebellion. Thus, spurred on by vendetta, Jarvan immediately uses his power as head of state to initiate the complete extermination of all mages across his kingdom, starting with Sylas and working his way down. It is unclear whether this includes his dragon girlfriend, but after the events of the visual novel, who's to say? It's also unclear what exactly is happening in Demacia right now, how the emboldened mage seekers are expanding their authority, and how this shift in power is affecting people's daily lives. According to Jarvan's adopted uncle, Xin Zhao, the prince had always been troubled by Demacia's treatment of its own mages, which is a little hard to swallow considering how eager he was to seize and execute all of them right after his father died. Xin Zhao himself is also complicit in the oppression of mages across Demacia. For decades, he served as the seneschal and closest confidant to the former king Jarvan III, which he grew to consider a close friend. He could have at least tried to express some concern over the mistreatment of mages in Demacia, seeing as he had the king's ear while the mage seekers grew bolder. Yet, he doesn't seem particularly interested one way or the other, concerning himself entirely with loyally serving the throne. Indeed, the only time that Xin Zhao shows any opinion on the matter is right after the mourning prince starts entertaining the idea of mass executions. "We should have executed them all," hissed Jarvan. Xin Zhao looked at the prince in alarm. He'd never heard him speak with such vitriol before. Indeed, he knew the prince had always been troubled by Demacia's treatment of its mages. But that was before. "I do not believe your father would share that view," said Xin Zhao in a measured voice. "And they killed him," snapped Jarvan. You would think that a man who grew up in Ionia, where magic permeates every aspect of daily life, would have at least some misgivings with Demacia's staunch anti-mage policies. But no, evidently he never thought to bring it up, and whatever moral quagmire was roused in him by Jarvan's open malignity came too little too late, as he was no longer capable of effecting any change within the system. Later in that same story, Jarvan commands Xin Zhao to burn a royal decree written by the late king, which, realizing he's not in control, Xin Zhao reluctantly does. The decree was meant for Lord Eldred, leader of the Mage Seekers, ordering him to stand down and cease arresting people for fun and profit. Jarvan, sympathetically blinded by anger, disregards the expressed dying wishes of his genocidal father and opts instead to double down on killing the mages. And I get it, it's the cycle of violence, blah blah blah, but are we really meant to believe this is a man troubled by Demacia's mistreatment of its mages? Similar to Luxana, Jarvan has not interrogated his privilege as a literal prince in his kingdom, nor has he wrestled with his family's long tradition of oppressing mages. Aside from getting a dragon lady into the royal guard and offering aid to the exiled mages off-screen, he has never ever sought to improve the lives of mages across his kingdom, nor has he ever challenged his father's genocidal policies. He has never criticized the Mage Seekers or the Dauntless Vanguard, and displayed no visible concern. He has never been shown to care about anything other than being a good king, or whatever he considers a good king, being with his girlfriend, and killing Sylas. This is an issue of Tell Don't Show, one that is further exacerbated by Riot's sparse and painfully glacial pace of storytelling. The last story about Demacia and the Mage Rebellion was released on the 12th of October in 2021, over a year ago at time of writing, and even that was a prequel only tangentially related to the current storyline. It is a sad truth that Riot Games seems content to put most of its lore on the back burner, as it is not a lucrative source of income for the company. They have forgotten and abandoned several plotlines in the past, such as the Bloodline plotline, and they cannot stay focused long enough to tell a complete story. This is easily observed with every new champion release, where a whole compelling character is crafted from scratch, only to be instantly forgotten and discarded, as there is no time or resources to inject any meaningful progression to their story. Champions like Samira, Vex, Neela, Rel, Yone, Lilia, Set, they're all narratively irrelevant and could be removed from the universe page entirely with no meaningful change observed in the broader story. As a result, things get forgotten, plot threads get pushed aside only to be retconned later, and it becomes very difficult for a reader to stay invested in the narrative. After all, if this character is doomed to obscurity, why read about them? If the events of this story are subject to revision, why care what it says? On top of all that, there's also the problem of lore fragments being scattered across the internet in Reddit AMAs, YouTube live streams, and obscure Twitter threads. Important pieces of backstory and world building are quietly handed out by writers or designers to be hunted down and, hopefully, compiled in a neat Wikipedia article courtesy of some very dedicated fans. In fact, these are details that are recorded only in Wikipedia articles. And if your lore output is so spasmodic and inconsistent that you need a Wikipedia page to keep track of what's what, then perhaps you're doing something wrong with your story. Of course, all these issues invariably combine to make your narrative into a weak mess. The Mage Seekers are an opaque organization tasked with containing the threat of magic across Demacia. The exact details of how they operate are, like much of Riot's lore, up for speculation, but they are certainly headed by Lord Eldred, Luxana's uncle who married into the Crown Guard name. Broadly, their history is something like this. The Mage Seekers began by creating a registry of all the known mages in the kingdom. They still arrested mages to throw within their dungeons, but allegedly they limited themselves to people deemed more dangerous than most. They owned large compounds which served both as vaults for the containment of magical items and as prisons for the afflicted. Mage Seekers also made efforts to further control the cultural narrative about magecraft in Demacia, removing any literature that portrayed mages in a non-negative light from public libraries, and generally adding to the existing anti-mage rhetoric. Gradually, there was an outpouring of support for their order by the Demacian nobility. Thus, the persecution increased, and the Mage Seekers began arresting or killing anyone with any magical power. After their arrest, mages would be tried and either imprisoned at a compound or exiled to the northern hinterlands, forced to abandon their homes, friends and family forever. If any friends or relatives of mages went to a Mage Seeker compound to ask after them, they would be turned away without an answer. It's possible that their family members would also be seized and taken in for examination, since the Mage Seekers consider magic to be a hereditary affliction. Furthermore, some mages were deemed too powerful to merely lock up or exile, so in addition to their life imprisonment, the Mage Seekers began force-feeding these mages a special anti-magic petricide potion to keep their power repressed. The side effects of this elixir are classically unclear and up for speculation, but there are in-fiction rumors that ingested petricide can cause, quote, bouts of excruciating pain, unquote. Beyond that, the Mage Seekers may brand their prisoners with the Mage Seeker crest and even go as far as to medically experiment on them, as was the case with Sylas. I bring all this up to demonstrate that the Mage Seekers and their allies are heavily inspired by real-life historical groups dedicated to the persecution and extermination of minorities. These are serious, heavy themes that demand a certain degree of respect and responsibility with how they're handled, qualities not immediately associated with third-way milquetoast centrism. Mage Seekers have caused human suffering on a scale that simply cannot be replicated without unfettered systemic backing from a powerful establishment. It's my opinion that no single mage or group of mages, however large, can ever match this level of violence without something like a world rune in their back pocket. Bearing all that in mind, let's talk about Sylas.
Sylas is introduced on the front page of the comic like this. On the left, Garen Crown Guard, standing proud against a blue and pristine sky, with a thriving city behind him. On the right, Sylas framed by flames and smoke, surrounded by blood red, and his face in shadow, with the demonic magical glow emanating from his eyes. Well, that is certainly an unbiased way to introduce a character. In the actual comic itself, Sylas appears for the first time on the very last pages of the book, and it looks like this. Sylas is introduced to Lux, pretty much exactly the same way that Hannibal Lecter is introduced to Clarice Starling in Silence of the Lambs. Well, that is certainly an unbiased way to introduce a character. In his color story, The Recruit, he welcomes a new recruit to the cause by having him watch as he violently executes a nobleman's retinue of servants to the jeers of a bloodthirsty mob, and then he manipulates the young recruit into murdering the nobleman personally. Well, that is certainly an unbiased way to okay, you get the joke.
From the outset, Sylas is portrayed as a manipulative, scheming, cult-fostering demagogue who outwardly espouses an ideology of liberation while secretly only desiring more power and control for himself. Not only is he violent and murderous, he actually revels in his cruelty. He enjoys humiliating and degrading the people he blames for his 15-year-long imprisonment. In the short story The Recruit, Sylas indoctrinates a young boy named Hap to the rebellion by teaching him to kill for the cause. Obviously, we stand. After ambushing a nobleman's entourage, Sylas lines up the guards and servants to be executed, reasoning that their complicity in an unjust system must be met with death. In minutes, all of the nobleman's guards and coachmen were lined up beside the road with their hands bound. Sylas paced the line, individually acknowledging each captive. "I ache for you all, I do," said Sylas. "You are merely cogs in their wheel." Sylas paused, his tone shifting harshly as he gestured to the bound nobleman. "But you chose to serve them, and thus serve their cause." He turned to his band of outcasts, loudly offering a question. "Brothers and sisters, these folk work in the service of swine. What does that make them?" "Swine," replied the outcasts. "Should we allow them to go free?" "No," yelled the mages. "What if they have a change of heart? Promise never to bother us again," asked Sylas, with a coy smile creeping across the corners of his mouth. "They'd be lying," yelled the scruffy old mage from the brush. "They can't be trusted," said another in the gang. "Then what is to be done with them?" asked Sylas. "They must die," shouted a young mage, his hatred beyond his years. Others yelled out in agreement until the phrase echoed across the land. "Swine must die." Sylas nodded as if he were slowly being persuaded by their words. so it must be. Sylas then asks Hap to kill the nobleman using his magic powers. The boy is horrified by this development and firmly refuses. Dispirited, Sylas tells him that he is not ready to join the rebellion and should return to his old life, presumably back within the darkest dungeons of the Mage Seeker compound. Conflicted, Hap makes his choice. I'm sorry, Hap, but you're not ready to be liberated. Go, return to your chains. Sylas watched as Hap turned to leave, his eyes averted in shame. The recruit looked down at the wrecked carriage in front of him and the long dirt road that wound back to the capital. Sylas could feel the boy thinking, dreading the misery that awaited him in his old life. Hap bent down, pried a dagger from the hand of a dead coachman, and returned to the nobleman, still struggling for breath on the ground. I am ready. As the youth raised the dagger above the nobleman, Sylas' sorrow turned to unmitigated joy. No matter how many he liberated, it always made him smile. God, this is so fucking stupid. This depiction is also consistent across the Lux comics, wherein Sylas manipulates Luxana into bringing him special scrolls and petricides so he can plan to break out of prison. A few issues later, Sylas frees himself by ruthlessly killing his executioners, whips a mob of mages into a frenzy to storm the palace, and sets up a mock trial to publicly humiliate and execute the prince. Once again, we stan. In a promotional image from right before his Champion release, Sylas is depicted as a shadowy figure lounging menacingly on the Demacian throne, while Jarvan's spear lies on the broken foundations in front of him, clearly meant to imply his tacit desire to ascend to more power. All these actions are very clearly condemned by the narrative, because God forbid men ever do anything, but a question remains. Why did Riot choose to write a firebrand revolutionary fighting against institutional oppression, only to characterize him as a sadistic, manipulative cult leader? Sylas is the only person in the entirety of Runeterra to call other people his comrades. Several of his voice lines allude to his desire to break down the walls of Demacian society, and he even references communist theory at least once.
How beautiful a world is without walls. Do your walls keep others out, or you in? Ah, Garen, first to die for the ruling class. Call it redistribution of magic.
Furthermore, he's an aggressive anti-monarchist and seems to strive for either a stateless utopia vis-a-vis the dispossessed or some sort of federated republic. He also probably supports the abolition of all prisons, seeing as though he has various voice lines referencing how they are bad and they should go away.
No more slums, no more dungeons.
According to a Reddit AMA, Sylas is an anarcho-collectivist. This ideology sort of completely runs counter to the repeated implication that he only wants power for himself, but maybe this clear hypocrisy is a conscious choice from the writers. Sylas, like many revolutionaries, is better at tearing down than building up. He reportedly hasn't thought much about practical policy or what a non-hierarchical system would look like on a large scale. Now, I believe that these are, in certain contexts, fairly valid criticisms of some real-world anarchists, especially those who largely seem out of touch with the real world. However, since Riot is a billion-dollar company operating on a centrist neoliberal mindset, it is rather hard to accept their criticisms as made in good faith, especially not given their track record with some of their other revolutionary characters. Sylas wants to abolish official titles like Sir or Lord, to elevate the poor and purge the nobility. These are all correct and based opinions, and it is quite a strenuous exercise in doublethink to see him constantly represented as a Machiavellian caricature, Bit like if a vocal slavery abolitionist spent half their week recreationally drowning kittens for sport. It is a trope rather tiresome and insipid. This type of character is not new to gaming. BioShock Infinite and Dragon Age 2 spring to mind, and there is some debate as to why they keep cropping up. Maybe it's because the writers are idiots, and in trying to create a morally grey character, they decide to overshoot and make them look ridiculous. Maybe it's because the writers don't understand or agree with revolutionary politics and mischaracterize their fictional advocates to make them seem more unreasonable. Or maybe large gaming corporations with notoriously toxic, union-less working environments and a rigid pro-business mindset of constant annual growth aren't interested in exploring stories that challenge a fictional oppressive status quo, no matter how detached it may be from everyday reality. Maybe these corporations don't care about artistic license and would rather just primarily release inoffensive stories about, I don't know, how centrism is the solution to every problem or whatever. In hindsight, it may have been unwise to turn a downtrodden prisoner into the villain of the Demacian storyline, because in real life, prisoners kept in isolation for too long are physically and psychologically obliterated. Inmates within Turkey's 23-hour isolation F-type prisons have reported a horrifying assortment of cascading health issues due to their incarceration, including but not limited to severely impaired eyesight, memory loss, arthritis, musculoskeletal pain, heart problems, trouble focusing, hypersensitivity to light or sounds, and in some cases, even hallucinations. Some of these prisoners were driven to take their own lives on multiple occasions. Sylas, after surviving 15 years in a cramped stone dungeon, should be unable to see, walk, think, or even speak coherently, much less lead a nationwide revolution. The man was denied open space and normal human interaction from his teens to his 30s. It's hard to imagine someone like that being a master of rhetoric and social engineering. Thus, it is a little strange and oxymoronic that Sylas, the person most victimized and brutalized by the Demacian regime, is the one posing the biggest, most credible threat to it. There is this bizarre notion in the grounder Riot narrative that the severity and morality of a violent act is proportional to the pleasure felt by its perpetrator, as well as the intentionality with which it was committed. The clearest example of this comes from Cytherea's perspective in the short story Turmoil, wherein she articulates the most awful line to arise from the Mage Rebellion plotline. After arriving at a Demacian village, a group of soldiers escorting 2 mage seekers and a mage is ambushed by armed, angry villagers. At first, they believe this to be because of their mage envoy, but they soon find out the truth. "You took her daughter," Cytherea breathed, looking at Cadstone. The mage seeker nodded grimly. "We had to," he said. "The law was amended. Any citizen with known magical power, benign or otherwise, is now ordered to be brought in for judgment. Every mage in the kingdom." "She was just a girl," shouted the woman, jabbing her crossbow in the mage seeker's direction. "You locked her away with all those criminals. Or maybe she has been exiled and is out beyond the borders, alone. You condemned her." Eventually, the situation is resolved without any deaths, and the villagers disperse. Near the end, Cytherea has this to say. Soldiers were still watching the last lingering townsfolk warily. Backer stood nearby, his expression clouded. Cytherea's gaze drifted to the pair of mage seekers, their expressions grim, then to the woman Rosalind, crying in the blacksmith's arms. All these people were Demacians, and all had good intentions at heart, yet recent actions had set them against each other. I think this last line demonstrates the issues with Riot's writing quite nicely. Sylas, a vengeful, vindictive man, is condemnable for his violence and murders because he extracted pleasure from their committal. He wants to get revenge for how he was treated and burn Demacia to the ground. Jarvan wants to kill Sylas, and if possible, all mages as well. His intent is to destroy out of hate and malice. However, his father, Jarvan III, is, in my opinion, not placed under the same weight of scrutiny, and neither is Garen, or Tiana, or even Lord Eldred. These people committed atrocities which arguably were considerably more severe both in scale and in effect than the murder of a few dozen people. Indeed, anyone who helped perpetuate this abominable system of exponential human suffering seems to get a free pass, in favor of instead talking about how Sylas and the Mage Seekers are comparable architects of evil. Garen only wants to keep his sister safe and to honor his house. He may commit atrocities in his day-to-day, but he doesn't want or directly intend to do that. Mageseeker Catstone merely wants to uphold the laws of the kingdom. He doesn't mean to cruelly separate children from their family. He just does it out of a dispassionate sense of following the rules. Xin Zhao only wants to guide and safeguard Jarvan and his future royal line. He doesn't intend to support a system of oppression, and he even feels a certain unverbalized deep concern when he is witness to yet another inevitable escalation. Tiana doesn't want to kill all mages. She just wants to protect her country and her family. A good motivation, not a bad one. It's a very strange and flawed double standard that crops up time and time again in various other stories, like in Shurima with Zerath and in Ionia with the Navori. It's a whole thing. This misplaced moral reasoning comes across as juvenile at best and narratively substandard at worst. As I've said, I don't think Riot's little Red Scare villain is being utilized to explore any meaningful themes beyond centrist wank. This is disappointing, but obviously not some unforgivable ideological transgression committed in the name of tarnishing the reputation of anarcho-collectivists worldwide. It is cringe though, and I am a sick man afflicted with the terminal disease known as League of Legends lore brain, and I can't stop thinking about it. I don't think there's any point in offering suggestions for improvement, since it's clear that Riot Games can never improve. This company is not capable of getting better. The sporadic nature of each new lore update, their frankly embarrassing and abysmal showing in the visual novel, along with their continued shift away from storytelling and towards esports of all things, has left little hope for even the most overzealous lore fan.
I really wanted to have some copium. I wanted to say that there is no big cinematic because they are gonna tie it into the big summer event. But my supplies of copium were consumed during the last summer event, where we also got nothing. Normally I would say there is most likely a reason why we didn't get a cinematic. Maybe Riot is working on something else, but I don't believe that anymore.
This company will never be as invested in their own story as they have made me be. But it can still be fun to speculate what it would have been like to live in a timeline where the glass is rosy and the pigs fly high. So, what would make the Mage Rebellion story less shit? Well, for one thing, stop demonizing Sylas. He's a person, not a satirical sketch on the cover of some Parisian newspaper. Actually inject some real complexity and humanity to his character beyond just suffering and being evil. Move his story forward without resetting everything to a convenient status quo you can revisit in an unpromised future show or franchise product. Don't make the thesis of your story say he's as bad as the genocidal fascists. That's just dumb. Sincerely consider what his role would be in an evolving society amidst an even more evolving political upheaval. Do not make him the absolute leader of an emerging rebellion. In fact, Do not make him the leader at all. Write new characters who actually bring something to the rebellion and leave Sylas be as a loud, influential, but singular voice among many. If peasants can organize an ambush against the most elite warrior force in the kingdom, they can probably motivate themselves to organize a rebellion as well without needing a demagogue to whip them into shape. Create polyphony within the fledgling rebellion and actually stop to think how the mages are planning to overthrow the kingdom and how they plan to survive long enough to see that first plan through. Do not give them a cop-out in the form of searching for a rock magical enough to solve all their problems. Give them something real. Are they disrupting trade? Are towns and villages refusing to recognize the state's authority anymore? Are the mages negotiating deals with other nations to gather support from abroad? How do they navigate this new internal political landscape? What ideas do they discuss for the future? What tangible hope do they fight for beyond liberation? How are they solving conflicts within their own community and with other communities who don't actively oppose them, but likewise refuse to offer them food or other kinds of support? What is the general sentiment towards mages and the rebellion now that most people have had a friend or a relative disappeared by the state? How has, I don't know, the fucking ruination affected things? How many people are even left alive by this point? Do some research on how real people actually respond to ceaseless systemic violence and depression. Don't just make all your downtrodden lowborn transform into a violent mob at the press of a button. None of the escaped rebel mages ever worked for a noble family? Or knew someone who did? None of them felt any sympathy towards the servants of the gentry while Sylas was cutting them down? None of them want to get together, speak up and hold him accountable? Don't just treat these characters as set dressing. Portray them as human people with complex lives that happen to briefly step onto the stage and then step off again. This is not reinventing the wheel. This is doing solid writing, and if a story can't offer you even that, perhaps it's best to move on. Unless you're like me, chained to the fucking bone and constantly yanked back whenever you try to let go. At the end of the day, Riot is trash garbage, and they aren't worth your time, money, or dedication, and they know this very well. That's why they've outsourced much of their storytelling to third parties that can do a better job of crafting a narrative than they ever could. Perhaps the upcoming Mage Seeker game will address all these criticisms and expand upon the story in a stunning, innovative way that will leave me speechless. Though it is much more likely that it'll simply be a competently crafted gameplay experience with an above average yet unremarkable plotline. Ultimately, what I personally want, is a Banner Saga clone with a Demacian coat of paint sprayed over it, a masterfully written visual novel mixed with some other gameplay element to push the player forward. But that's just a fantasy that will haunt my dreams until I die. Your takeaway from all this should be that Riot Games is just some company with some cringe story in their video game's obscure lore, and nothing about any of it matters, and you should be glad you're not as brainwormed as people like me. If you can believe it, I'm one of the self-aware ones. The other fans are far worse. Finally, if you've managed to make it this far into the video, I am so sorry. But at least now you know never to watch my videos ever again. Peace.